Imagine standing in front of someone you love, not just romantically, but deeply. You crave their validation, their warmth, their approval. You tell yourself it's affection, that it's love. But if you're honest, it feels more like hunger. Every word they say becomes oxygen, every silence a suffocating void. You start to adjust your tone, your laughter, even your opinions, just to keep them close. You call it compromise, but deep down, it's something darker, a quiet terror of being alone, unseen, unchosen. And maybe that fear runs deeper than you think, because what if neediness isn't just emotional weakness? What if it's the modern form of slavery? Not the kind enforced by chains, but by invisible threads of psychological dependence. You don't need bars to be imprisoned. All it takes is the belief that someone else holds the key to your worth. Think about it. How much of what you do, the texts you send, the words you bite back, the dreams you postpone, comes not from freedom, but from fear of losing someone? We've romanticized neediness. We call it loyalty, vulnerability, selflessness. But look closely and you'll see the same pattern repeated through every human relationship, the desperate dance between validation and rejection, power and submission. It's the silent battle of every soul, to be seen without begging, to love without losing oneself. But here's the paradox. The more you need someone, the less power you have. The more you cling to love, the faster it slips away. The more you try to prove your worth, the more invisible you become. So what then is the cure? To detach completely, to become cold, indifferent, untouchable? No. That's just the opposite side of the same coin. Emotional self-sufficiency isn't numbness. It's understanding that your value exists even when no one else sees it. But how do you reach that point when every instinct, every neuron, every story you've ever been told screams that love is the only thing that makes you whole? Maybe that's the real tragedy of being human. We keep trying to drink from others what can only be found within. So the question isn't just how to stop being needy, it's deeper, it's darker. Why do we need so much in the first place? And who taught us to mistake dependency for love? Because somewhere between the fear of abandonment and the desire to belong, we lost the art of empowerment. And until we find it again, we'll keep mistaking chains for connection and calling it love. Neediness doesn't begin in relationships. It begins in childhood, in that fragile space between wanting to be loved and learning what love costs. A child reaches for comfort. The parent turns away, delays, or disciplines. The lesson imprints itself quietly. Love must be earned. Approval becomes currency. Affection becomes reward. And from that moment on, the mind begins its lifelong pursuit, to perform, to please, to prove. By adulthood, that conditioning has evolved into a psychological prison. You begin to live in response to others, their moods, their approval, their silence. Your emotions fluctuate according to how you're received. You're no longer the author of your own worth. You're a performer on someone else's stage. Carl Jung called this the loss of the self, when one's identity becomes so entangled with external expectations that the true self suffocates beneath layers of adaptation. What remains is a carefully constructed persona, polite, agreeable, always seeking harmony, but secretly, deeply afraid. Friedrich Nietzsche would call this the morality of the weak, a subtle form of submission disguised as goodness. He warned that our craving for acceptance often hides a fear of standing alone. He who cannot command himself, he wrote, will obey others. And Machiavellie, the master of power, would smirk knowingly. He understood the paradox of dependence better than most. Men are driven by two principal impulses, love and fear. Neediness is what happens when love becomes fear. Fear of loss, fear of insignificance, fear of disconnection. It is, at its core, the most effective form of control. Modern psychology echoes this. Attachment theory tells us that those with anxious attachment live in a perpetual state of vigilance, scanning for signs of withdrawal or rejection. Their nervous system reacts to emotional distance the way the body reacts to hunger, panic, craving, desperation. To be needed becomes their only proof of value. But what if that need is precisely what keeps them powerless? Because the needy person doesn't just want love, they depend on it to survive. And in doing so, they give away something sacred, the sovereignty of the soul. Neediness is not a flaw of emotion, it's a distortion of identity. It's what happens when love becomes a transaction and connection becomes a negotiation. And that's the dark root of the problem. We've built a world that rewards dependency and punishes self-possession, from advertising that whispers, "You're not enough," to relationships that thrive on imbalance. Everything around us teaches the same lesson, that empowerment is selfish and neediness is love. But is it really? Or have we mistaken the chains of emotional dependency for the warmth of intimacy? Because what looks like devotion might actually be disguised fear. And that fear, subtle, invisible, ancient, is the hidden force steering most of our lives. The tragedy of neediness isn't just emotional. It rewires your entire existence, silently, invisibly, until you no longer know where you end and others begin. You start shaping yourself to fit into other people's expectations like water filling a mold. You mirror their moods. You anticipate their disapproval before they even speak. You call it empathy, but it's really surveillance, emotional espionage in the name of safety. It's exhausting, yet somehow it feels safer than being alone. That's how dependency deceives you. It masquerades as love while eroding your freedom. You start to mistake peace for silence, connection for control, affection for permission. And when you live long enough in that illusion, something inside you starts to vanish, not suddenly, but piece by piece. First, your opinions shrink, then your boundaries, then your dreams, until all that remains is a fragile echo of who you used to be, whispering beneath the noise of someone else's validation. Cognitive psychology calls this self-abandonment bias, the subconscious pattern where the brain chooses approval over authenticity because it confuses acceptance with survival. It's the same ancient circuitry that once kept tribes alive. To be rejected was to die. And even though the modern world no longer runs on tribal exile, your brain doesn't know that. It still equates disconnection with danger. So you keep adapting. You overthink your words. You apologize for existing. You perform niceness to avoid discomfort. You even sabotage healthy relationships because deep down, chaos feels safer than uncertainty. This is how societies are built on silent manipulation, not through force, but through emotional dependency. A population that constantly seeks approval will never question authority. A partner terrified of abandonment will never set boundaries. A worker desperate for recognition will never demand fairness. Neediness at scale becomes control. Nietzsche once warned that those who need love the most are often the least capable of giving it. Because when love becomes survival, it's no longer pure. It's a transaction of power. Every "I love you" hides an unspoken "don't leave me." And that's the cruelest part. You begin to attract exactly what you fear. The more desperate you are to be chosen, the more likely you are to find those who exploit that desperation. The needy attract the narcissistic, the controlling, the indifferent. Because to a predator, need is opportunity. What begins as longing turns into dependency. What begins as vulnerability turns into surrender. And in the process, empowerment becomes a distant memory, something you once read about, something that sounds noble but feels impossible. Because by the time you realize you're trapped, the chains don't even feel like chains anymore. They feel like love. Freedom doesn't begin with cutting ties, it begins with cutting illusions. You don't escape neediness by withdrawing from people, you escape it by reclaiming yourself. That means learning to stand alone without mistaking solitude for emptiness, independence for arrogance, or self-respect for coldness. Because true empowerment isn't about needing no one, It's about no longer needing permission to be who you are. But the rebellion begins quietly, not with grand declarations, but with small acts of truth. Saying no when you mean no. Expressing a thought without rehearsing it. Letting silence exist without scrambling to fill it. Every time you do, something ancient stirs within you, the part of you that remembers what freedom feels like. Machiavellie once said that he who becomes master of himself cannot be mastered by others. This is the essence of psychological sovereignty. You stop being a servant to validation and become the ruler of your own mind. It's not easy. You will lose people, the ones who benefited from your compliance, the ones who mistook your softness for weakness, the ones who only loved you as long as you needed them. Let them go. Because empowerment requires loss. Not the loss of love, but the loss of illusion. The shedding of every false belief that your worth depends on someone else's gaze. Viktor Frankl, who survived the concentration camps, discovered a truth that few ever grasp. That between what happens to us and how we respond, there lies a space, and in that space lies our power. Most people live their entire lives without ever stepping into that space. But once you do, you realize something extraordinary. No one can truly control you unless you surrender that space willingly. This is not about becoming detached or cynical. It's about loving without losing yourself, about standing in the fire of connection without melting into it. Real love, after all, is not dependency. It's two whole beings choosing each other freely, not two broken ones clinging out of fear. So how do you begin? You start with the smallest rebellion of all, presence. Notice when you shrink. Notice when you explain yourself unnecessarily. Notice when your body tenses to please. Don't judge it, just see it. Awareness, as Jung taught, is the first act of liberation.